Right, ladies and gentlemen, the next speaker is Jacqui James from Cambridge. She's interested in plants and pollinators and how they interact, and also the effect of climate change on them. She's a PhD student at Cambridge, and she's particularly her PhD is on the shrill carder bee, and particularly the conservation of it.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to just start by thanking AES for inviting me to speak today at your Members' Day. And I'll be sharing some of my PhD research that I've been doing over the last 3 years. So I'm working with Lynn Dix at the University of Cambridge and Richard Comont, who's from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. They are my supervisors. So yes, let me begin. So in the UK, there are 24 species of bumblebee, and one of these is the shrill carder bumblebee. It's one of the smallest bumblebees, and it's called the shrill carder bumblebee because of its high-pitched buzz that you actually, if you see a number of bumblebees in the field, after a while, if you get familiar with the shrill carder bumblebee, you can distinctly hear the higher buzz compared to that of other bumblebees. It's recognizable through the fact that it has these straw-colored hairs across the body, and then a distinct black band of hairs between the wings, and an orange tail. Now, the shrill carder bumblebee can be confused with a number of species, one of these being the early bumblebee, which having 2 yellow bands, an orangish tail, and black hair between the thorax and the abdomen can superficially look a bit like a shrill carder bumblebee. And then also with the common carder bumblebee, which especially towards the end of the season when workers are rather worn, they can get a bare patch of hairs between the wings that can then expose the black thorax and can trick you into thinking that it's actually a shrill carder bee when it is not. So these are just 2 particular species to look out for if you're looking for shrill carder bumblebees. So shrill carder bumblebees, like most bumblebees, have queen and workers, and they form a colony in a similar-ish way to honeybees, except for colonies only survive for 1 year. So in the spring, the queens come out of hibernation, and with the shrill carder bumblebee, this is actually one of the last bumblebee species to emerge from hibernation. And so these queens are only coming out in May, which is quite late for a bumblebee. So the queens then go, they forage, then they start to establish their nests, and they incubate the first brood of eggs, and then those eggs hatch, and that's the workers that hatch, and then they continue to help with looking after the brood and foraging for the colony. Then towards late summer, then the colony starts to produce male bumblebees, as well as new queen bumblebees, and these then leave the colony and they go out and mate. And it is only then the new queens that have mated that can go into hibernation. The rest of the bumblebee colony dies off as you head into autumn, and only then those new queens the following spring emerge to start new colonies again. So the shrill carder bumblebee, it's known to nest in the bases of thick grasses, so just above the soil or just below the soil level. Here's some photos of shrill carder bee nests. And then this is a nest that I saw in Pembrokeshire. You'll see in a moment a shrill carder bee fly into the nest there. So now I have a question for everyone. If you've seen a shrill carder bumblebee, please raise your hand. Okay, well, the lack of response is actually not too surprising because the shrill carder bumblebee in the last 60 years has declined massively. It's gone from being widespread across most of England and Wales to now only being found in 5 areas in the south of England and in the south of Wales. So I've been really fortunate during my PhD to get to visit all 5 of the remaining places where shrill carder bees are still found in the UK. So that being in Pembrokeshire, you can see some of the habitat where we found them in the Castle Martin Range. Then between Kenfig and Port Talbot, there's another small population there. So I saw them at Kenfig National Nature Reserve, where they were enjoying visiting the purple loosestrife flowers that were flowering at the time. And then the probably biggest population of shrill carder bees in the UK is in the Gwent Levels, so between Newport and Cardiff. And if you definitely want to be guaranteed to see a shrill carder bee, and with the most likely probability of seeing one, I highly recommend you go to Newport wetlands, because I was amazed to see it there as actually the most common bumblebee species present. So in August, Newport wetlands is the place to go if you want to see shrill carder bumblebee. There's lots of everlasting pea flowers that they have around the reserve, and it was buzzing with shrill carder bees, which was wonderful to see for such a species that it's become so rare. Then there's also a population in Somerset. So this is a photo of me with the first shrill carder bumblebee I saw in 2024 in Somerset, right near the beginning of my PhD. And then finally, there's a population along the Thames estuary between Essex and Kent. Here's some vegetation near Coalhouse Fort, where I also saw a number of shrill carder bees. So in response to this decline of the shrill carder bee, a number of actions have been taken. And one of these is a conservation strategy that was produced by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in collaboration with a number of other organizations to really understand what is known about the shrill carder bee, and what steps can be taken to conserve the species in the UK. So it's actually a fairly relatively understudied species compared to many other bumblebees, which are typically actually quite well known, with they just being quite a distinctive group. So there's quite a lot that actually isn't known that needs to be researched in order to support the shrill carder bee in the UK. So things from what the population genetic structure is, considering how the effects of climate and potentially moving climate envelopes with climate change might be affecting the species, having a greater understanding of the ecological requirements of the species, how habitat and habitat change might also affect the species, and then potentially if there are factors like pathogens, pesticides, or maybe competition with other bees that might be affecting the species. So my PhD research is looking at a subset of some of these questions, looking at the population genetics, and then considering the ecology and habitat requirements of the species. So while we don't know what the specific cause of decline of the shrill carder bumblebee is, something that is known in general is that something that's caused many bumblebee species in the UK to decline is agricultural intensification. So this is a process that's happened since the mid-20th century, where there's been a changeover from traditional management of grasslands as traditional meadows to what is now what's called improved grassland, which is dominated by grass species with very few flowering plant species within this. This is mostly done through the application of fertilizers and changes of management. And this has resulted in large swathes of land with very few flowers available to support pollinating insects such as bumblebees. And this has actually been to the extent that over the last 75 years, semi-natural grassland in Great Britain has reduced from 75% of the area to 30% of the area, as you can see with the changeover from this minty green color in map A to increased yellow, showing the improved agricultural grasslands in map B. One might wonder though, we all do care about insects with why we're here today, but in general, why actually is this decline of pollinating insects specifically actually a problem? So there are multiple reasons for this, but one of them is that pollinators play a really important role in the pollination of many crops. But secondly, they play a really important role in the pollination of many, many wild plant species. And so actually really crucial for the functioning of many ecosystems and maintaining that, keeping ecosystems functioning as we know them to do so. So what is being done about the decline of the shrill carder bumblebee and pollinators in general? So one example is a project that the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has been running in Somerset since 2011. It's called the SOS Save Our Shrills project, where the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has been working with land managers to restore habitat for pollinating insects to help increase the number of flowers available, as well as increasing monitoring to support pollinators in these regions. However, it's unknown how effective this restoration of habitat in Somerset has been. And so this is where my project then comes in. So we've had the opportunity with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and the University of Cambridge to partner together through what's called the RESPOL project. So this is a European-wide pollinator restoration project that's looking at how effective pollinator restoration is for pollinators. So we have formed a case study area in Somerset where this restoration has been taking place, and through this are assessing how effective the restoration has been. So our case study area in Somerset is one of 17 case study areas that are part of the RESPOL project across Europe, which are all using the same field methods to assess the effects of different restoration implementations on pollinating insects. So within the case study area, with my PhD, I've got 3 main research questions that I'm interested in. The first being, how effective has the restoration been on the abundance of different species of pollinating insects, as well as on the different flowering plant species that are available to these insects at these sites? Secondly, considering what associations are present with the different interactions between certain groups of insects and certain plant species at these sites. And then thirdly, considering if you have a site that's restored, how much potential is there for insects at those restored sites to then disperse into the greater landscape, and with that have an influence on supporting insects in that greater landscape around those restoration sites? So to study this, we've got a study design, which is a similar study design that's used throughout the RESPOL project. And the restoration sites within the RESPOL project are called living lab sites. And this is because the restoration has been designed with collaboration between various stakeholders, between land managers, various organizations like the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, researchers, in order to try and really have a holistic approach to getting the best outcomes possible, taking expertise in multiple different sectors. So to assess if restoration is effective, you need to look at what a site was like before the restoration took place in order to compare that with a site where the restoration has taken place. So in the case of our project, most of the sites that were restored were conventionally managed pastures. And so our control sites for the project are conventionally managed pasture fields. So we have what we call our in control, which is a conventionally managed pasture within 2 kilometers of the restoration sites. And this is so we can look at the effects of the spillover of the dispersal of pollinating insects into the greater landscape. And then we have our out control sites, which are in the greater landscape more than 2 kilometers away. So you can see if there's a difference in the abundance and diversity of insects at those sites. And then finally, we have positive control sites. So these are fragments of flower-rich grassland that didn't go through this agricultural intensification process. There's very few examples of this left in the south of Somerset where we're working, but we have these as a benchmark to see what the plant and pollinator communities could be like at a site as something to aim for through the restoration. So over the summer last year, I conducted 3 rounds of field surveys at our sites. So we have 23 sites in total. So that's 6 of the restoration sites, 6 of the in control and 6 of the out control, then 5 positive control sites. So at each of these sites, we were doing a pollinator survey looking at bees, butterflies, and hoverflies, where we had a transect of 150 meters, then walking along that for a fixed time of 15 minutes with a hand net, observing and recording all the different species of these groups that we could see. And when not possible, then collecting to identify later in the lab. We also wanted to quantify what flowers are available to pollinators at the different sites. And so we had 5 quadrats along these same transects, where we're counting the number of flower units of each plant species. So a flower unit is what you would consider basically what an insect would visit without needing to fly to the next flower. Because you can have inflorescences, which are collections of lots of small flowers, which would be considered one flower unit compared to say, like a buttercup flower, which is a single flower that a bee, for example, would fly between. So last year, we conducted over 140 surveys and did additional searches in the surrounding area to look for shrill carder bumblebees. Yet, we did not see a single shrill carder bumblebee in Somerset last year. And this is really concerning for the species because, in fact, actually only 2 individuals were recorded in Somerset at all last year. And so there's definitely great concern about how the shrill carder bee is actually going to survive in Somerset or not. We did, however, collect data on a whole range of other pollinating insects. And since a species doesn't exist alone, but in a community of other insects and plants and other species, we can then see the effects of the restoration on the greater pollinating community and hope that if the shrill carder bee is able to recover, and then understand what kind of community it's then fitting in. So I'll be presenting some initial results from my research from last year. So first of all, looking at the abundance of the floral units. So we found so I've got box plots here with the 3 survey periods. So that's in May, the end of June, and early July, and in August. And so we have our sites. I'll just remind you again. So the in-control sites, those are the conventional pastures that were within 2 kilometers of the restoration sites. So L, that's the living lab sites, which is the restoration sites. O, the out-control sites, so the conventional pastures that were more than 2 kilometers away from the restoration sites. And then P, the positive control sites, which are those remaining fragments of the species-rich meadows. So you can see in spring, we have on average similar abundances of floral units at our restoration sites compared to the positive control sites, and higher than that of the other control sites. And then slightly higher than, remaining slightly higher going across the season. But last year, towards the end of August, it was already so dry with the drought that most plants at that point had given up trying to flower, and it had just everything dried out. So that definitely would have had some influence on what plants actually were still flowering or not anymore. So while this is interesting considering the abundance of different floral units, it actually doesn't really give a very clear indication of what resources are available to pollinators at these sites. Because, for example, the nectar and pollen that a bumblebee could get from this red clover flower is not actually equivalent to what a bumblebee could get from this buttercup. And so one of my next steps is to quantify actually the abundance of nectar and pollen that you can get from different plant species to see how that differs between the sites. So these 2 fantastic data sets are available, published by Baudet et al., that have quantified the volume of nectar and the sugar concentration available from a whole lot of UK plant species, and similarly with pollen. So you can I can do these calculations to see what resources are available from the different plant species at these sites for pollinators. Then moving on to the insects. So down the side, I have a few photos of some of the bumblebee species we saw during the surveys. And again, we're seeing quite high numbers actually of bumblebees at the restoration sites. And in early spring, that was actually notably higher than that at the traditionally managed meadows. But quite a lot of variation between our sites was still seen. And interestingly, towards the end of the season, the restoration sites had distinctly higher numbers of bees than seen at the other sites. Moving on to the butterflies. So again, here's some photos of the some of the different butterfly species that we saw. Interestingly, as you would expect, we had the most butterflies we observed in June, July, which is when most of the butterfly species are active, and which is what you would expect. And so we're pleased to see similar numbers on average at the restoration sites compared to the positive control sites. I think we're interested to note that, or compared to the positive control sites, sorry. We're interested to note at the in-control sites, so these are the conventional meadows that were within 2 kilometers of the restoration sites, that there are actually fairly high numbers of butterflies there too. And with butterflies being quite mobile species, of being good flyers, this is potentially a sign of spillover, with butterflies dispersing from positive control, from the restoration sites to these other areas, but this is something I'm interested to explore further. And then finally, looking at the hoverflies. So again, some photos of some of the hoverfly species we saw. In the spring, flare was higher than at the 2 conventional meadow sites at the restoration sites, but not as high as the positive controls. Yet this switches around when we get to the middle of the year, with on average the highest being seen at the restoration sites. And then with a few sites maintaining actually pretty high numbers towards the end of the year. But again, quite a lot of variation between our different kinds of sites and within each kind. So in conclusion, it looks like the habitat restoration is actually benefiting pollinators, which is great to see. However, the effects on the shrill carder bumblebee are unclear since we did not see any, but the absolute lack of shrill carder bees seen in the area and the fact that the populations have continued to decline shows that this restoration is not being effective in halting the decline and supporting the species. So it's important to consider what factors in the habitat or what other factors might be stopping the restoration from supporting the shrill carder bee and what can be done to adjust the restoration or other steps that can be taken to try and support the species in South Somerset. So I'm conducting further field surveys this year. I already conducted one round in May recently, and then again I'll be doing in late June, early July, and in August, following the same methods to have a second year of data. As bumblebee populations are really known to fluctuate quite a lot between years and seasons, and different weather patterns in different years can have quite a big influence. So I'll then have a second year of data to see actually how effective has this restoration been and how are the different insects and different insect communities doing between the years. And with that, we're still hoping that maybe we will see an increase again of shrill-carded bumblebees in Somerset, but this is yet to be seen. So before I end, I just wanted to give a few quick points on what you can do if you want to help with supporting the conservation of declining species such as the shrill-carded bumblebee. And one of these is to help with uploading records. So if you are out and you're observing species, if you can upload them to a platform such as iNaturalist or iRecord, this gives a really useful just database on where species are being seen and when, which is really useful for when you're researching different species to know where they're being seen across the country, which is for species like the shrill carder be really useful to know then where, as a researcher, you can go and look and see, okay, this is actually the place where they currently are and how it changes between years. If you want to get more involved with helping monitor bumblebees, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust runs a national recording scheme called Bee Walk. And so with this, you commit to walking a transect of 1 to 2 kilometers each month, and then you submit what records of bumblebee species you've seen during your transect walk. So this is really useful for looking at how bumblebee populations are fluctuating across the country over multiple years. It's a project that's been running for quite a number of years, and the data is already being used for quite a lot of research studies. There's a number of people in my research group who have been using the Bee Walk data in various studies. So this is a great project to contribute to. And then finally, with species like the shrill carder bumblebee, since they are really quite a late emerging species, something that's really important for them too is to have flowers available right across the season and right into the late part of the summer and into the autumn. And so for supporting the shrill carder bumblebee, it's really important that if you have an opportunity, like if you have a garden, if you can help make sure that you've got flowers available in your garden right from late summer into early autumn, that is one way you can help support some pollinators such as the shrill carder bumblebee to making sure there's enough flowers available for them. So I'll finish off there. I'll just like to thank my funders listed there at the bottom, as well as to all the site managers who gave me access to field sites for the project. And then a special thank you to all my field assistants, especially to Annie Norfield, one of my lab mates, who's assisted me with all the surveys so far. And yes, thank you very much for listening.
Hey, any question?
There are so many environmental fluctuations between years, especially recent, that is 3 years too short a time to establish firm data.
Ideally, like long-term studies are definitely what you want in order to see trends over a long period of time on how different insect populations are, how they're faring because of these big variations between years. But with the 2 years of data I have, it'll at least give some indication of what actually is present at the sites and how effective in terms of in the short time period this restoration has been. Whether or not how it will change going further into the future, we don't know. we also don't know really what the weather's going to do going into the future. And so there are lots of complexities there. So it gives an idea at the present of what current status is. So yeah, one of the big limitations in doing research is managing to get funding for multiple years to do long-term studies. So there are many short-term studies when ideally long-term studies would be the preference.
Shrill carder bees favour ivy blossom.
I haven't heard anything specific about them visiting ivy. There are a number of species that they are known to visit, but ivy hasn't been one that I've heard of.
That in the living lab sites, there were a couple that always really low. Were they the same sites each time, and did the sort of respiration not really work on those ones?
So I haven't actually looked into that level of detail yet, with it being my initial results, but it'll definitely be really interesting to consider on a site-by-site basis how that varies, and actually maybe if there's something at those specific sites that might be causing things to be different.
Yeah, similar to that, I saw in your positive control site, I think for both like flowers and bees, there was like outlier that was really high. So do you know which site that is, and why in both circumstances it happened so?
Yes, so I think especially with the flowering plant species, I know which would be that outlier. There's a site that's called Whitefield that's part of the Wildlife Trust, and it's just a really particularly fantastically flower-rich grassland. And when we were doing the surveys in spring last year in May, and within one of the 2x2 meter plots, there were over 1,000 birds-foot trefoil flowers. And so it was just a really densely flowering field. That was why that particular one was such an outlier in terms of the flowers.
It's the same one that was really high up. I think it was bees.
Again, I haven't looked at that, so that will be very interesting to see.
So you mentioned that your next step is going to be looking at like actually what the flowers are providing. Obviously, the amount that they're providing is one thing, but the sort of macronutrient or micronutrient content of the nectar and pollen is also some choice. Do you know anything about the more fine scale taste preferences of the shrill carder bee, or is that a hard study that being so?
So there was a master's student last year at Royal Holloway University who was studying shrill carder bee floral preferences. I think she's still in the process of publishing her results. But what I remember from what I heard from those results, that white dead nettles seem to be quite an important plant, especially for the shrill carder bee queens at the beginning of the season. But for the workers later on in the season, I'm not yet sure what her results were for that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really very interesting.
Thank you.